The village of St. Mary Mead had always been regarded as a model of tranquility, a place where nothing more dramatic occurred than the occasional dispute over a boundary hedge or a particularly fierce rivalry. At the annual flower show, yet beneath its quaint cottages, stone walls, and ivy-hung lanes, Miss Jane Marple had long suspected that human nature complex, contradictory, and sometimes cruel thrived in just as much abundance as roses in June. It was on a brisk autumn afternoon, with the trees turning copper and gold, that Miss Marple found herself invited to tea at Gossington Manor, recently purchased by Colonel Geoffrey Redmayne and his wife, the elegant but rather nervous Mrs. Clara Redmayne. The couple were not local by birth, but they had settled in St. Mary Mead only 6 months earlier, determined, so it was said, to escape the bustle of London and the whispers surrounding the Colonel's hasty retirement from the War Office. Gossington Manor was a fine Georgian house, set back from the road behind wrought iron gates, with lawns that swept towards the river. The villagers, curious as ever, had already formed opinions about its new occupants. Some thought Colonel Redmayne to be charming, others called him brusque. As for Mrs. Redmayne, she was regarded with both sympathy and suspicion. Sympathy for her delicate health, suspicion for the faint air of secrecy she carried with her. Miss Marple, of course, reserved judgment. She had learned through long observation that people were rarely what they first appeared. When she arrived that day, ushered into the drawing-room by a maid who looked too polished to be local, the atmosphere struck her immediately as unusual. The fire was lit, the tea service gleamed with silver, and yet the air seemed charged like the moment before a thunderstorm. There were 6 others assembled in the room. Colonel Geoffrey Redmayne, tall, square-jawed, his voice clipped with authority. His smile came readily, but it never quite reached his eyes. Mrs. Clara Redmayne, a slender woman with anxious hands and a fondness for pearls. She seemed perpetually on the verge of saying something, and then thought better of it. Dr. Lionel Hawthorne, the village physician, genial but ambitious, with a fondness for pontificating on matters outside his expertise. Miss Evelyn Blake, Clara's younger cousin, a lively, modern young woman of 20, who favoured smart suits and spoke with a candour that often startled her listeners. Mr. Arthur Pendleton, a retired solicitor, precise in his speech, meticulous in his dress, and rumoured to have once courted Clara before her marriage. Mrs. Lydia Arkwright, the Redmaynes' neighbour, a widow of ample means, with a hearty laugh and a disconcerting ability to notice everything. The company was polite enough, but there was something beneath the surfacey, an undercurrent of tension, a note of discord. Miss Marple, who always noticed such things, took her seat quietly in a chintz-covered armchair, and began, as was her way, to knit. Tea was poured, sandwiches offered, and yet the conversation faltered. Colonel Redmayne attempted jovial anecdotes of his military service, but these fell flat. Miss Blake teased Pendleton about his bachelor ways, and he stiffened in reply. Mrs. Arkwright chattered about her roses, until Mrs. Redmayne, pale and distracted, set her teacup down with such a tremble that the saucer clattered. It was at that moment that Miss Marple observed something most curious. Colonel Redmayne had risen to pour himself another cup of tea, and in doing so, his hand brushed against the sugar bowl. A fleeting glance passed between him and Dr. Hawthorne, so swift that most would have missed it, but Miss Marple did not miss such things. Still, nothing of consequence appeared to happen. Tea continued. The clock on the mantel chimed 5, and Mrs. Arkwright excused herself early. The rest lingered, talking of inconsequential matters, until at last Miss Marple, too, rose to take her leave. The next morning, however, all of St. Mary Mead was astir with shocking news. Colonel Geoffrey Redmayne had been found dead in his study at Gossington Manor. His body was slumped across the desk, an empty teacup at his side, and a peculiar expression frozen upon his face. Dr. Hawthorne, summoned at once, suggested heart failure, perhaps brought on by stress. Yet others whispered that the colonel had been in perfect health only the evening before. Mrs. Redmayne was inconsolable, Evelyn Blake distraught, Pendleton tight-lipped, and Mrs. Arkwright curious in the extreme. Inspector Craddock from the county police had arrived to make his inquiries. A man of solid build and sound common sense, he was inclined to accept Dr. Hawthorne's opinion, but he had learned enough of Miss Marple to know her instincts were not to be disregarded, and Miss Marple, sitting quietly by her hearth with her knitting on her lap, felt the same unease she had felt the day before in the drawing-room at Gossington Manor. It was not, she reflected, merely a matter of a man's sudden death. It was the air of secrets, blood, tea, and secrets that hung about the place. And secrets, as she well knew, had a most uncomfortable habit of coming to light. In the days that followed Colonel Redmayne's sudden death, St. Mary Mead was alive with speculation. The news travelled faster than the autumn wind through the hedgerows. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley confided that she had always thought the Colonel looked far too ruddy in the cheeks for a man his age bound to end in apoplexy. At the post office, Mr. Foote declared it was a shame to go so suddenly after a mere 6 months in the village. At the church, murmurs suggested that perhaps the Redmaynes' move from London had been prompted by some scandal best left unspoken. Miss Marple listened to all of it with her usual serene expression, knitting needles clicking steadily. But within her mind, threads were already beginning to connect. Inspector Craddock had taken charge of the formal inquiry. He had ordered a post-mortem, though the doctor's preliminary report still insisted on natural causes. Yet Craddock, having consulted briefly with Miss Marple on a previous case, knew enough to keep an open mind. On the third morning after the Colonel's death, Miss Marple received a discreet note from Mrs. Redmayne, asking if she might call. Clara Redmayne's handwriting was delicate, the loops faint, as though the very act of writing had been an effort. When Miss Marple arrived at Gossington Manor once more, the atmosphere had changed entirely. The household, draped in quiet mourning, seemed hollow. Black crape bows adorned the door, and the maid who admitted her looked strained. **** Mrs. Redmayne greeted her in the drawing-room, eyes reddened, a lace handkerchief twisted in her hands. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice faltering, "you were here only the other afternoon. I can hardly believe—" She broke off, covering her face. Miss Marple settled gently beside her, laying a comforting hand on her arm. "I am so very sorry, my dear. Sudden loss is the hardest of all to bear." Clara looked at her with something like desperation. "The doctors say it was his heart, but Geoffrey was never ill a day in his life. He was strong, vigorous, too vigorous. Sometimes I cannot help but think," her words faltered, but Miss Marple supplied them softly, "that it was not nature alone which carried him off." Clara clutched her handkerchief tighter. "Yes, but to say such a thing, it seems disloyal." Miss Marple, who knew well the conflict between loyalty and suspicion, said nothing, merely allowed silence to do its work. At length Clara went on. "There were strains, you see. Geoffrey was not an easy man. He kept things from me. And then there were quarrels, though he would never have admitted it. Evelyn spoke too freely sometimes, and Arthur Pendleton, well, Geoffrey never liked him in the house." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, filing each word away. "And Dr. Hawthorne?" she asked gently. "Oh, Lionel was often here. He and Geoffrey had some understanding, medical, political, I never knew which. Sometimes they argued fiercely, then laughed as though nothing had happened. It made me nervous." Here Miss Marple interjected quietly. "And Mrs. R. She seemed on easy terms with your husband." Clara's lips tightened. "Too easy, perhaps she is. Fond of company, and Geoffrey encouraged her visits. But I cannot believe Miss Marple, I hardly know what I think any longer." Miss Marple patted her hand. "It is always best, my dear, not to decide too soon what one believes. People can surprise one sometimes, most unpleasantly." As she left the manor, Miss Marple reflected. Clara's grief was genuine, but behind it lay a tangle of tensions, financial, emotional, even political. And somewhere within that tangle was the truth. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Arkwright, who lived in a comfortable red brick house overlooking her gardens. She found the widow dressed in fashionable mourning black, though her manner was anything but subdued. "My dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Arkwright exclaimed, ushering her into a drawing-room heavy with potpourri. "What a dreadful business, though I can't say I was altogether surprised. The Colonel was a man of appetites, you know. Strong tea, strong opinions, strong temper. Such men burn brightly and then burn out." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "And yet, one might say his end was rather sudden." Mrs. Arkwright lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Sudden indeed, but mark my words, there's more to it. Did you see the way young Evelyn Blake looked at him the other day? And poor Clarochy was half in tears even before the tea was poured. Oh yes, there are secrets in that household." Miss Marple listened without outward comment. Village gossip was like yeast in bread. It caused things to rise, but one must be careful not to swallow it raw. Still, Mrs. Arkwright's observations were rarely baseless. 2 evenings later, Inspector Craddock stopped by Miss Marple's cottage, He removed his hat and sat stiffly, a man uncomfortable with conjecture. "The post-mortem shows digitalis in the Colonel's system," he said bluntly, "enough to be fatal. That's a heart medicine, though he was never prescribed it. We're treating it as suspicious." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "Digitalis, is it? Derived from foxglove. Very effective when used rightly, very dangerous when not, and rather bitter in taste, unless disguised." Craddock grimaced. "The housekeeper says he took tea that evening. Sugar could have masked it." Miss Marple recalled the faint glance exchanged between Colonel Redmayne and Dr. Hawthorne at the sugar bowl. "Yes," she said softly, "tea is such a comforting ritual, and yet, how often do we consider what it may conceal?" The inspector leaned forward. "You were there, Miss Marple. You saw them all. If you had to put money on it." Miss Marple raised a hand. "No, Inspector, it is far too early for conclusions. In matters of murder, one must be careful not to see only what one expects. People can seem wicked when they are merely foolish, and seem innocent when they are anything but." Craddock sighed. "Then I'll have to keep digging. I suppose you'll be doing a bit of your own, listening." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One does hear a great deal in a village, Inspector, more, perhaps, than one realizes." Over the next days, Miss Marple set about her listening at the grocer's. She overheard Evelyn Blake arguing with the maid about deliveries, her voice sharp with impatience. "We can't be expected to live on bread and jam. Colonel or no colonel, this house must function." There was a hardness in the girl. Miss Marple thought that might conceal desperation at the churchyard. She encountered Mr. Pendleton, who greeted her with solemn courtesy. Yet, when she gently inquired after Clara, his expression softened in a way that suggested more than mere friendship. "She needs support, poor soul," he said gravely. "I intend to see she has it." Miss Marple did not miss the possessive note in his voice, and at the doctor's surgery, she heard Dr. Hawthorne railing to his assistant. "Confounded nonsense, all this suspicion. The man had a weak constitution, I tell you. I treated him as I treat all my patients, with care. If there were medicines in his system, someone else put them there." His protestations seemed rehearsed, too defensive by half. Each piece was a stitch in the growing fabric of the mystery. Colonel Redmayne was dead, poisoned by a substance bitter enough to require disguise. Each of those present at tea had both opportunity and motive, though of different sorts. Miss Marple sat by her fire that evening, reviewing the threads. Evelyn too eager, too modern. Pendleton too possessive. Hawthorne too defensive. Arkwright knowing. Clara too fragile, but perhaps not so helpless as she appeared. And there, in the centre of it all, lay a teacup. Miss Marple's needles paused midst. She saw again the Colonel's hand, brushing the sugar bowl. The glance with Dr. Hawthorne. She thought of secrets unspoken, of blood that bound and secrets that poisoned. The investigation had only begun, but already Miss Marple felt the shape of a darker pattern emerging. Autumn deepened in St. Mary Mead, the evenings drawing in with a mist that curled over the hedgerows and dampened the cobbles. The village might have seemed serene to an outsider, but for those who knew its rhythms, there was an unmistakable tension. The Colonel's death hung in the air like an unspoken accusation, and people began to speak more freely, sometimes too freely, of what they thought they knew. Miss Marple, moving quietly among her neighbours, listened, observed, and stored away each remark with the precision of a collector placing specimens in labelled drawers. A visit to Evelyn Blake, restless and modern, had taken it upon herself to manage much of the Redmayne household affairs in the days following the Colonel's death. When Miss Marple called with a basket of scones, Evelyn received her in the morning-room, her cigarette-holder balanced carelessly between long fingers. "You know, Miss Marple," she said with a half-laugh, "the whole village seems convinced Geoffrey was murdered. Isn't it absurd? People do love a drama. I suppose they're all whispering that I slipped poison into his tea. Me, of all people." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled gently over her knitting. "One mustn't be too hard on village gossip, my dear. It is often wrong in its details, but sometimes correct in its general direction." Evelyn gave her a sharp look. "Well, I won't pretend I adored him. He was impossible, domineering, suspicious, and quite out of step with the world. But murder, no, thank you. I prefer to deal with my difficulties head. A poisoned teacup isn't my style." Her tone was flippant, but beneath it Miss Marple detected something taut, as though Evelyn were a violin string pulled too tight. The girl's hands shook slightly as she tapped ash into the tray. "I dare say you were fond of Mrs. Redmayne," Miss Marple observed mildly. Evelyn's expression softened. Poor Clara, he bullied her, though she would never admit it. I thought moving here might calm him down, but it only made him worse. Still, she loved him, in her way. She shrugged. I suppose that's love for you, half habit, half fear. Miss Marple tucked that remark away. It was not the statement of a heartless girl, but of one who had seen too much for her years. Pendleton's defense later that week. Miss Marple encountered Mr. Arthur Pendleton in the churchyard, inspecting a new memorial stone with fastidious care. He straightened when he saw her, removing his hat. "Miss Marple," he said gravely, "these are sad days indeed. Very sad." Miss Marple agreed. "And yet, life does go on, does it not?" He sighed. "Yes, though for Clara, I fear it will be difficult. She was devoted to him, for all his faults." Miss Marple looked up at him, her eyes deceptively mild. "And you, Mr. Pendleton, you have known Mrs. Redmayne some years." His jaw tightened. "Since before her marriage. I had hoped, once, that that is in the past. My only concern now is her well-being. She must be protected from gossip, from suspicion. It is unseemly." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "And yet, people will talk." Pendleton's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then it is our duty to shield her. If Geoffrey had enemies, they were of his own making. Clara must not suffer for them." Miss Marple thought, as she watched him stride away, that devotion could sometimes be as dangerous as hatred. Dr. Hawthorne's uneasiness. Marple's next encounter was at Dr. Hawthorne's surgery. She had brought a posy of chrysanthemums for his assistant, for the desk, you know. It brightens things up, and was rewarded by overhearing the doctor in conversation. He was speaking sharply to someone on the telephone. Asterisk, asterisk, "I've told you before, I will not discuss it over the line. It's too dangerous. You'll ruin everything if you persist." "No, that's final." The receiver slammed down, and a moment later he emerged, smoothing his hair. When he saw Miss Marple, he forced a jovial smile. "Ah, Miss Marple, how good of you. Flowers, eh? Splendid things, chrysanthemums, hardy fellows, quite unlike us poor mortals." Miss Marple inclined her head. "One must take care not to overuse foxglove, too, mustn't one, Doctor? So very effective in its place, so very fatal when not." For just an instant, Hawthorne's genial mask slipped. Then he laughed, a trifle too loudly. "Quite so, quite so. But we medical men are trained in such matters. Ordinary folk have no access to such substances." Miss Marple's needles clicked. "Oh, you would be surprised, Doctor. In villages, people often know more than one expects. Old remedies Lingerson remembered. Some misused." Hawthorne muttered something about patients waiting and excused himself. Miss Marple left her mind busy with that overheard telephone call. The second instant it was a week after the Colonel's death that another shock rippled through the village. Late one evening, Clara Redmayne was found collapsed in her bedroom, barely conscious. Evelyn, coming to fetch her, raised the alarm. Dr. Hawthorne was summoned at once. He pronounced it a fainting fit, brought on by shock and exhaustion. But Miss Marple, arriving the next morning, noted the telltale smell on the bedside glass of water. Bitter, sharp, quickly fading. Digitalis again, she wondered, or something else altogether. Clara, pale and weak, insisted it was nothing. "Just grief, Miss Marple. I hardly eat or sleep. My nerves are wretched." But Evelyn was furious. "Someone is trying to kill her, can't you see? Geoffrey first, and now Clara. We must find out who." Inspector Craddock, summoned once more, was less certain. She could have taken it herself, accidentally or otherwise. Medicines lying about, mistakes made, happens all the time. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. Clara Redmayne, for all her fragility, did not seem the type to dabble in dangerous powders. No, this was deliberate, a second strike, perhaps meant to silence the one person who knew more than she had yet confessed. Miss Marple reflects that evening. Back in her neat parlour, Miss Marple sat with her knitting and let her thoughts unravel and reknot themselves. Who would wish Clara dead? Evelyn had no clear gain from it indeed. She seemed protective. Pendleton, if anything, wished to preserve her. Hawthorne, perhaps, if she knew something about him. And Mrs. R. She had motive for mischief. But would she go so far? Miss Marple thought again of that tea-table, the sugar bowl, the fleeting glance between Hawthorne and the Colonel, the tremor in Clara's hand, Evelyn's too careless words, Pendleton's solemn devotion, Mrs. Arkwright's all-seeing eyes. The pattern was forming, but too many loose threads dangled. The widow's revelations. It was Mrs. Arkwright who supplied the next twist. She invited Miss Marple to tea, an invitation no one declined, for her table was always abundant. Between plates of seed cake and ham sandwiches, she leaned across the table. "My dear Jane, I must tell someone or I shall burst. You know me, I don't like to keep things bottled. The night before he died, Geoffrey Redmayne came to see me. Yes, indeed. He looked quite agitated, muttered about papers and trust funds, and asked if I had noticed anyone prowling about the garden. I told him no, of course, but he seemed unconvinced, said he was being watched. Then he left in a state." Miss Marple raised her brows slightly. "Watched, did he say? By whom?" Mrs. Arkwright shook her head. "He didn't say, but there was something fearful in his manner, almost as though he expected to be struck down." This revelation altered the balance. The Colonel had been afraid. He had known something was amiss. And now Clara had nearly followed him to the grave. Red herrings over the next few days. Several small discoveries clouded the waters further. A bottle of digitalis tincture was found in Dr. Hawthorne's surgery, its label tampered with. He swore it was for legitimate patients. Evelyn was overheard quarrelling with Clara, saying bitterly, "You never told me the truth. You let me think," and then falling silent when she realized others were listening. Pendleton was discovered going through the Colonel's papers late at night, caught by the maid. He claimed he was protecting Clara from distressing business matters, and Mrs. She was found to have visited the apothecary only 2 days before the death, purchasing a tonic that, when tested, contained traces of foxglove. Each revelation pointed a finger, and yet each seemed almost too neat, too ready to mislead. Miss Marple, piecing these together, felt a quiet certainty forming. The truth was tangled in tea and secrets. Yes, but human nature, in the end, was remarkably consistent. People killed for love, for money, for fear of exposure. And the Colonel, with his secrets and his domineering ways, had given each of those about him reason enough. The question was, which secret was worth killing for? As she set down her knitting and trimmed the lamp, Miss Marple knew that the time for quiet listening was drawing to a close. The next stage would require careful nudging, a subtle test to see which mask would crack. The murderer was among them still, and sooner or later they would make a fatal slip. The storm that had hung over St. Mary Mead since the Colonel's death seemed at last to break. Rain lashed the village lanes, windows rattled in their frames, and at Gossington Manor the atmosphere was thick with apprehension. Within its walls, everyone felt the eyes of suspicion upon them. Miss Marple, moving quietly between her parlour, the vicarage, and the manor, sensed that the time had come. The pattern was almost complete, though a few stitches still gaped. What she needed now was a spark, something to expose the threads for what they were. A telling conversation. Inspector Craddock arrived one evening at Miss Marple's cottage, coat dripping, hat in hand. He looked harried. "I don't mind admitting, I'm at a loss," he said, accepting a cup of hot tea. "I've questioned them all until I'm hoarse. They've each had the opportunity. They've each something to gain or to hide. But the evidence, Miss Marple, it's smoke, not fire." Miss Marple poured milk delicately into her own cup. "It often is, Inspector. Murderers seldom oblige us with confessions. One must look, instead, at the very small things, what people do without thinking." Craddock frowned. Such as sugar," Miss Marple said softly. The inspector blinked. "Sugar? Yes, it disguises bitterness. A spoonful can mask the taste of many things. And at the tea table, one sees who takes it, who avoids it, who watches it too closely." Craddock shook his head. "You noticed something that day, didn't you?" Miss Marple's needles clicked. "I noticed a glance, the Colonel's hand at the sugar bowl, Dr. Hawthorne's eyes upon him. A small thing, perhaps, but human beings betray themselves in such moments. The Colonel was no fool. He suspected whom? Asterisk. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That, Inspector, I am about to discover." Clara's confession the next day. Miss Marple called once more upon Clara Redmayne. The widow lay propped upon pillows, her complexion still wan from her collapse. Evelyn hovered nearby, restless and protective. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you must tell me what you know. Your husband was afraid. Mrs. Arkwright told me as much. He spoke of being watched. What was it that troubled him so?" Clara's fingers twisted the bedspread. For a long moment she was silent. Then, in a whisper, she said, "He had papers, documents from the War Office. He was not meant to keep them, but he did. He said they were important, that they could protect him if questions were asked." But I think she broke off, tears glistening. You think someone else wanted them? Miss Marple prompted. Yes, he told me once that knowledge was power, but knowledge is also dangerous. I begged him to destroy them. He would not, and now the papers, gone, Clara whispered. After his death, I looked. The drawer was empty. Miss Marple's heart quickened. So that was the secret. Not love, not money, but documents worth killing for. A trap laid that evening. Miss Marple paid a call on Inspector Craddock. I believe, Inspector, that the Colonel's papers were the key. Someone wanted them enough to poison him. We must bring the truth into the open. And how do you propose to do that? By arranging a little gathering, Miss Marple said serenely. A tea party, if you will. People reveal themselves most clearly over tea. Craddock looked dubious, but Miss Marple was insistent. The gathering at Gossington Manor 2 days later, at Miss Marple's suggestion, Clara invited all those concerned to the drawing-room of Gossington Manor. The rain had passed, leaving the air sharp with autumn chill. A fire burned brightly, and on the table gleamed a fresh silver tea service. Evelyn arrived first, tense and defensive. Pendleton followed, grave and watchful. Mrs. Arkwright bustled in, full of curiosity. Dr. Hawthorne came last, his genial manner forced. Inspector Craddock stood by the mantel, his presence official but silent. Miss Marple, ensconced in her familiar chintz chair, took up her knitting. Clara, pale but resolute, poured the tea. The clink of china was the only sound. At last, Miss Marple looked up. We are gathered here, she said in her gentle voice, because there are questions to be answered. Colonel Redmayne did not die of natural causes. He was poisoned, and the same hand attempted to poison his wife. There was a collective gasp, a protest from Hawthorne, a sharp intake of breath from Evelyn. Miss Marple went on. The poison was digitalis, bitter in taste, yet easily masked by sugar, and it was at the tea table that the opportunity arose. Pendleton protested stiffly. This is outrageous. You cannot accuse without proof. On the contrary, Miss Marple said, the proof lies in behavior. Colonel Redmayne suspected he was being watched. He guarded his papers closely, but at that last tea, he noticed someone too interested in the sugar bowl. He realized too late. Her eyes, clear as glass, turned upon Dr. Hawthorne. You, doctor, had access to the drug. You sought those papers perhaps for political gain, perhaps to sell, perhaps simply to protect yourself. The Colonel's death would silence him, but when Clara began to speak, you feared she knew too much, so you tried again. Hawthorne's face reddened. Absurd. I am a man of medicine. I've devoted my life to protecting yourself. Miss Marple said softly. I overheard your telephone conversation. You warned someone not to persist, that it would ruin everything. That was not the voice of an innocent man, Doctor. That was the voice of one afraid. The room was silent. The fire crackled. Evelyn stared. Pendleton clenched his fists. Mrs. Arkwright leaned forward eagerly. At last, Hawthorne laughed harshly. And what, pray, is your evidence, madam? A glance at a sugar bowl. Idle gossip. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Human nature, Doctor. You see, murderers rarely escape it. When Clara fainted, you were the first to insist it was nothing serious. You tried to wave it away, but I smelt it on the water glass. You alone had both the knowledge and the fear. And now, she gestured delicately, Inspector Craddock will confirm that certain papers, missing from the Colonel's desk, were found in your locked case this very morning. Hawthorne's composure shattered. He sprang to his feet, eyes wild, then sagged back into the chair as 2 constables entered. You meddling old woman, he spat. Miss Marple's needles clicked. Yes, Doctor, it is a most dangerous habit of mine. The truth revealed under questioning. Hawthorne's story unraveled. He had been passing information during his London years, documents meant never to leave the War Office. When the Colonel retired, he brought papers with him, intending to keep them as insurance. Hawthorne feared exposure, and when persuasion failed, he resolved to act. The sugar at that final tea had concealed the fatal dose. Clara's near-death was his second attempt. Clumsier, and rushed out, as the constables led him away. The others sat in stunned silence. Clara wept softly. Evelyn held her hand. Pendleton muttered a prayer. Mrs. Arkwright declared she had suspected it all along though, of course, she had not. Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly into her bag. It is always the little things, she said gently. A glance, a tremor, a word spoken too quickly. People reveal themselves in the smallest ways. That evening, as she returned to her cottage, the mist rising once more over the hedgerows, Miss Marple reflected on the affair. Blood, tea, and secrets. She thought so much concealed in a single cup, but truth, like steam, always rises. The arrest of Dr. Lionel Hawthorne reverberated through St. Mary Mead like the toll of a church bell, loud, insistent, and impossible to ignore. Within hours, the story had spread across every cottage, hedgerow, and garden gate. Villagers paused mid-hoeing in their gardens, bakers leaned across counters, and old men in the public house shook their heads gravely. The trusted physician, the genial neighbor, unmasked as a murderer. For Miss Marple, there was no triumph in the revelation, only a quiet certainty that justice, once more, had surfaced through patience and observation. She knew human nature rarely changed. People could be charming, dutiful, or respectable in appearance, but underneath, ambition, fear, and weakness wrote their truer story. The aftermath at Gossington Manor. Clara Redmayne, newly widowed and newly betrayed, faced a difficult road. Miss Marple visited her the following morning, bringing flowers from her garden, late roses, soft pink and faintly scented. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, placing them in a jug, "you have shown great courage. Few could endure what you have endured with such grace." Clara managed a small, weary smile. "It doesn't feel like courage. I feel emptied, Miss Marple. Everything is gone. My husband, my trust in the people around me, even my peace of mind. I wonder if life will ever be ordinary again." "Ordinary has a way of returning," Miss Marple assured her. "It may come quietly, in the rustle of leaves or the sound of church bells. But it comes. You will find solace in small things, your books, your garden, even the kindness of neighbors. Time softens grief, though it never quite erases it." Evelyn, who had been sitting by the window, rose abruptly. Her face was pale, her voice taut. "At least now we know. All the whispers, the suspicion, it wasn't us, Clara. It wasn't you. It was him." Clara reached for her friend's hand. "Yes, it was him." Miss Marple watched the two women. She suspected Evelyn's devotion went deeper than mere friendship. Whether Clara ever returned, it was another matter. Such feelings often lay buried in polite society, unspoken yet powerful. Miss Marple tucked the thought away with the delicacy of one who observed but never intruded. Inspector Craddock's gratitude. A few days later, Inspector Craddock called at Miss Marple's cottage. His manner, a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "I don't know how you do it," he admitted, accepting a slice of seed cake. "There we were, chasing shadows and supposing grand conspiracies. And you," he gestured with his teacup, "you spotted it at the tea table." Miss Marple smiled. "It was not cleverness, Inspector, only attention. Poisoning is an intimate crime, you know. It requires the victim to trust, to eat or drink what is offered. That is why so many cases are solved by watching who places the cup before whom." Craddock shook his head. "I'll never look at a sugar bowl the same way again. The thing that troubles me, though, is how close he came to getting away with it. If Clara had died, too." He stopped. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "but evil is often impatient. It rushes where caution would serve better. That is usually its undoing." The inspector leaned back, studying her. "Tell me, Miss Marple, do you ever grow weary of all this? The death, the deceit, the ugliness?" Miss Marple looked out of her window at the roses climbing her wall, their petals trembling in the breeze. "On the contrary, Inspector, it strengthens my belief in goodness. For every wicked act, I see 10 acts of kindness, neighbors tending one another, children playing innocently, friends sitting in companionship. Evil may shout, but goodness whispers steadily, and in the end, it endures." Craddock was silent, moved despite himself. At last, he stood. "Well, if ever Scotland Yard tires of me, I shall come to you for lessons." Miss Marple chuckled. "I fear you would find my methods too domestic, Inspector, but you would be most welcome all the same. The village reacts in St. Mary Mead." The gossip ran like wildfire. Mrs. Arkwright, of course, claimed she had suspected Dr. Hawthorne from the beginning. "I said it, didn't I?" she told anyone who would listen at the grocer's. "That man's eyes were too shifty, and those hands always fiddling. I knew it meant something." Mr. Pendleton, the churchwarden, spoke more gravely. "It is a tragedy when trust is broken. The man healed our children, tended our sick, sat in our pews, and all the while, he carried murder in his heart. It makes one wonder whom one can rely on." To which Miss Marple, passing by, remarked gently, "Why, Mr. Pendleton, one relies on human nature. It may be frail, but it is also consistent. People reveal themselves, always, in time. The villagers nodded solemnly, though few fully understood her meaning. Quiet reflections as autumn deepened. Life in St. Mary Mead settled once more. Leaves drifted across the lanes, fires were lit in hearths, and evenings drew in earlier each day. The memory of the Colonel's death lingered, yet already it was softening into story one, more chapter in the long annals of village life. Miss Marple returned to her garden, her knitting, her visits to the vicarage. She took satisfaction not in triumph, but in the restoration of peace. Yet sometimes, when she poured her evening tea, she paused a moment, remembering the faint bitterness in Clara's cup, the watchful gleam in Hawthorne's eyes. She thought of Clara, who was beginning to walk in the garden again, pale but steadier. She thought of Evelyn, hovering at her side. Perhaps, Miss Marple mused, the future held a companionship stronger than either had expected, and she thought, too, of Inspector Craddock, whose earnestness she found most refreshing. Young men, she reflected, could learn much, if they but listened. The final word one evening. As the church bells tolled across the fields, Miss Marple sat by her fire with a fresh piece of knitting. The flames flickered, casting gentle light upon the neat room. She murmured to herself, blood, tea, and secrets, such a combination. But in the end, truth has its own flavor. One cannot disguise it forever, not with sugar, nor charm, nor pretense. It will always make itself known. Outside, the village lay quiet, as if wrapped once more in safety. Yet Miss Marple knew better than most. Beneath every tranquil surface ran the hidden currents of human nature, capable of both tenderness and treachery. And so she knitted on, patient and watchful, knowing that when the next storm came to St. Mary Mead, she would be ready.